And until 2022, Senior Visiting Fellow at the Nathanson Center on Transnational Human Rights, Crime, Security, and Security at York University in Toronto. So please join me in welcoming Emilio. Is your mic on?
Hello, hello.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's working now.
Yeah.
Thank you to the organizers first for inviting me on being here. These are difficult times. And maybe it's good that we get together. I don't have power. I was asked if you need a power. So no, I don't want to present power. PowerPoints at the end of the and in a PowerPoint, I could only show you pictures and images that I'm sure you have seen. I can explain to you what the reduction of the Palestinian territory has been since 1948 today. I'm sure you have seen these pictures. You have seen the pictures of suffering, people being killed, and I didn't want to show you this kind of images, but rather to invite you to first explore with me, trying to understand what the Nakba is, what the mechanisms have been, and what the effects that we are seeing today are. I was invited to talk about the Nakba, but I'm not a historian. At first sight, it seemed a strange choice by the organizers. Maybe I should simply leave. No, I want to rather say that it's actually good that the organizers did not be the historian, because that would send a misleading message. The Nakba is not really a historical event pertaining to the past. It is rather a structure and a process. It is a process of dispossession, domination, annihilation, and negation that started in 1948, that has gone through different stages and modalities since then and continues until today. In my intervention now, I want to first explain the Nakba as a structure and as a process, and then I would like to invite you to think about the Nakba with me. To explain the Nakba as a process, I think begs an important question. How was the Nakba possible? And what prevents us from stopping this process and dismantling the structure that we call it? I will say that the International Court of Justice decision regarding South Africa's demand for provisional measures in the case of genocide against Israel gives some hints to a possible response. The decision, even though without a determination on the merits, which would take years, declared that it was plausible that Israeli acts in Gaza since the 7th of October constitute genocide. What a devastating indictment. What a devastating indictment a colonial enterprise justified by its founders as a response to the Jewish genocide in Europe is 76 years later brought to the Hague for the violation of the International Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, inspired precisely by Jewish suffering. Rather than becoming the embodiment of the never again, the majority of the Israeli Jewish society chose to embrace a racially supremacist, exclusionary, and brutal colonial ideology, Zionism. The country was built on a negative ethic, one based on the negation of the other, the negation of their present, the negation of their history, and the negation of their humanity. We have seen how Israelis are taught to hate and despise everyone in the region, to kill without concerns, and to negate the evil of their actions under the guise of permanent and exclusive victimhood. Protected by the sheer power of guns, Israel is also capable of simply negating what it has itself become, a negative force producing oppression, death, and life. The genocide in Gaza is only the last reflection. In order to explain how did we arrive here, I will resort mostly to the words of Israeli Jews and other non-Jewish Europeans. Not because their voices have more authority than many voices of Palestinians who have been saying the same things for a long time, but as an act of politeness, to accommodate the inability that we observe in the defenders of Zionism, their inability to lend credibility to the Palestinian historical narrative. So let's try to explain the narrative through Israeli Jewish eyes. As Ilan Pavel, a member of the group called the New Israeli Historians, those who in the 1980s began a courageous revision and critique of the historical narrative of the State of Israel, as Pavel puts it, and I quote, Zionism began as a European national movement, but it became colonialist once its leaders decided to implement their vision of national rebirth in the land of Palestine. End quote. If by colonialism we understand the acquisition or conquest, in whole or in part of the territory and political control of another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically, well, there is no doubt that Zionism became a colonialist movement. But even more so, it also became a supremacist ideology that has served to justify horrible crimes, the longest occupation in the world's contemporary history, the systematic violation of the most basic rights, in short, the dehumanization of an entire people. The supremacist ideology that Zionism became is expressed in different ways by different leaders. Benny Morris, another of the new Israeli historians, quotes Shalim Weizmann, president of the Jewish Agency at the beginning of the 20th century, saying that, quotation mark, the indigenous population was similar to the rocks of Judea, obstacles that had to be cleared in a difficult path. Or listen to Lord Balfour in 1919. Quotation, Zionism, whether right or wrong, good or bad, is of far bigger importance than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Palestinian Arabs who now inhabit the ancient land. This disdainful and supremacist view of the Palestinians translated into an attempt to make them invisible and justified another slogan of the Zionist movement, a land without a people, World Without a Gun, describing Palestine as an empty and infertile desert. But Palestine was already a nation with a defined territory and a rich and active social, political, and cultural life. To justify its conquest, Zionism chose to make that reality invisible through several practices. One of them is the denial of the Palestinian existence as a nation. The denial of Palestinians as a nation was first articulated institutionally in the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which referred to the Palestinians simply as existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, when in fact they represented an overwhelming majority of the population. It then became a commonplace in Israeli discourse. Shane Westman, again, Golda Meir's statements that Palestinians do not exist are just a few examples. These negotiations in the early 1990s were also framed in such terms. Palestinians were only able to attend the negotiations in Madrid as part of a Jordanian delegation. Another way of making Palestinians invisible is Israel's denial of the Palestinian presence on the land. The policy of Judaization and the Arabization of Palestine has been carried out in different ways since the creation of the State of Israel, destroying hundreds of Palestinian towns and villages, building on them or covering the remains of forests, renaming entire regions, towns, streets, hills, valleys, using archaeology to highlight Jewish history on the land by destroying and ignoring the evidence of the immemorial presence of another people, or even the laughable claim that hummus or falafel are Israeli dishes, are just a few examples of this. Another form that the invisibilization of Palestinians has taken is the denial of their ability to produce a reliable historical narrative. This is why I propose you to understand the Nakba through Jewish eyes. Despite the existence of a solid Palestinian historiography that reports of facts omitted by official Israeli history, and that establish Israel's responsibility for the conditions of dispossession and expulsion of Palestinians. These facts have only been seriously taken into account once the new Israeli historians have made them their own in the late 1980s. What they show, these new Israeli historians, is that what has happened in Palestine has not been the unexpected product of war and conflict, but rather that they have been deliberate acts with a clear objective: the conquest of the greatest possible amount of territory with the smallest possible amount of Palestinian population. The result was the Nakba disaster in Ireland in 1948. The massive dispossession and expulsion of Palestinians from the land, then the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, then the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip in 1967, new forced displacement of Palestinians, the reduction to the isolated Bantustans completely controlled by the Israeli army, their daily humiliation at checkpoints, the destruction of their homes, and the indefinite detention of men, women, and children in Israeli prisons. And finally, Gaza and the current genocide. The Zionist leaders and those who supported them were perfectly aware of the existence of an Arab population approximately 1,300,000 persons in 1948. They knew what they would have to do to create their state on the terms that Zionism stipulated. They had a plan, and they have been executing it to this day. In this regard, Iran Pape quotes Ben-Gurion saying, "I support the mandatory transfer, of course, with expulsion of the Palestinian population. I don't see anything immoral in it." End of quotation. But Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the most prominent of the revisionist Zionists and inspirational leader of the Likud, the political party of the current Prime Minister Netanyahu, has said it much earlier. I quote, "We cannot give any compensation for Palestine, neither to the Palestinians nor to other Arabs. Therefore," and this is Jabotinsky, "a voluntary agreement is unconceivable. All colonization must be carried out in defiance of the will of the native population, and it can continue and develop only under an iron wall that the local population will never be able to break. This is our Arab policy. To formulate it any other way would be hypocrisy." Zionism, he continues, is a colonization adventure, and therefore stands and all falls on the question of the Arab. The conclusion of this was, of course, the violent expulsion of more than half of the 1,300,000 Palestinians through organized attacks on Palestinian villages and numerous massacres carried out between 1947 and 1948. The organization of the expulsion was spelled out in detail in the infamous Plan D, that Palestinians had denounced for a long time and was later discovered by Muslim Israeli historians like Ilan Pavel in the archives of the Israeli state. Of course, the plan was that the expulsion of Palestinians would be without return. And this, despite the fact that one of the conditions for Israel's admission to the United Nations was precisely that the new state complies with Security Council Resolution 194, declaring the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their lands or to be compensated. That was never complied with. However, the Zionist plans were very different. In 1949, Yigael Yadin, one of the founding members of the Zionist militia Haganah, writes to Moshe Sharet and says, quote, "Due to the spread of disease among Palestinian refugees, I propose that," this is 1949, "I propose that we declare a quarantine in all conquered areas. We will be able to oppose more strongly the demand for the return of Palestinian refugees and the infiltration of returning Palestinians into the abandoned villages. In addition to our opposition to the return, comprehensible on the military and political terrain." End quote. These plans and policies would seal the fate of approximately 78% of the territory of historic Palestine and the refugees from 1948. Now, what happened to the Palestinian population that remained in the territories they are today part of Israel? Currently, around 20% of the country's population. Well, they were first subjected to martial law, a military regime that would last until 1966, but also to the massive confiscation of their lands and later to countless laws that discriminate and exclude them. This has been made possible through Israeli legal and constitutional practices that operate to reconcile the two evidently contradictory principles of Israel's definition of itself as a Jewish and democratic state. The Israeli Declaration of Independence, for example, transformed a community of settlers into a political collective and declared Israel the state not of its citizens, but of the Jewish people exclusively. Subsequently, Israeli legislation materialized this vision, sacrificing, of course, democracy to secure its pretended Judaism. Adalah, an Israeli human rights organization, counts more than 50 laws that discriminate against Palestinians in Israel in numerous domains. These laws, in general, tend to exclude the native Palestinians. The law of return, for example, turns the settled population into a nation state whose contours are defined by the exclusion of the Palestinian owner. The laws and practices related to citizenship, immigration, and residence allow the identity of the state to be consolidated by securing a Jewish majority in the country. The electoral system and the basic law of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, play an important role in constructing the limits imposed on the political representation and self-determination of the Palestinian minority. They eliminate the indigenous population as a political unit. They maintain its members only as individuals with diluted political demands and limit political representation to those who agree with the principles of Zionism and do not challenge them. Let's keep going. Once the new state had been consolidated, the issue of borders became paramount to the Israeli leadership. In this regard, Tom Seged, another of the Israeli historians, quotes Ben-Gurion in 1949, saying, quote, before the founding of the state, Ben-Gurion, on the eve of its creation, our main interests were self-defense. But now, the issue at hand is conquest, not self-defense. As for establishing borders, it is an open question. In the Bible, as well as in our history, there are all kinds of definitions of the borders of the country, so there is no real limit. No border is absolute. And the irony of this is that Asilan Pape says, although most Zionists did not believe in God, they believed that he had promised them. This is precisely why Israel has never officially declared definitive borders, because, as Ben-Gurion declared, the goal was to erect a Jewish state now, even if it is not the entire land of Palestine. The rest will come in the course of time. The logical conclusion of this was the war that Israel launched by surprise during the Muslim Ramadan of 1967, which would ensure a slow Arab response and victory. As Avi Shlaim, another of the new Israeli historians, states, quotation, the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza in 1967 had very little to do with security and everything to do with territorial expansion. The objective was to establish Greater Israel, though through permanent political, economic, and military control over the Palestinian territory. The result has been one of the most prolonged and brutal military occupations of modern times. And then came the disastrous effect of the Oslo Accords. Those agreements signed between an occupier and the leadership of an occupied people, which, according to international humanitarian law, could be considered illegal and having no legal value. However, some thought that those agreements would result in an independent Palestinian state in the 67 lines. As we already know, after almost 31 years of Oslo and multiple attempts to negotiate an end to the Palestinian colonial condition, a real independent and sovereign Palestinian state seems further away than ever, and colonization goes ahead quicker and more violent than before. Now, the results of Oslo, as in the case of the Nakba in 1948, are not the consequences of random circumstances, but rather the effects of a plan. If by signing Oslo, Palestinians believed in liberation, the intentions of the Israeli government were very different. It should not surprise us. The Israeli leaders have themselves stated this from the very moment that these agreements were signed. Any progress in the negotiation depended on the commitment and efficiency of the Palestinian Authority to control its population and quell political activism against Israel. That is to say, the objective of the PA, the Palestinian Authority, in the agreement was to protect the occupation regime. In September 1993, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, explaining why he had signed Oslo, declared, quotation, "The Palestinians will be better at it fighting the resistance than us, because they will not allow appeals to the Supreme Court and will prevent Israeli human rights organizations from criticizing. They will govern with their own methods, freeing, and this is the most important thing, the Israeli soldiers from doing what they will do." Right. One of the strongest pieces of evidence that this was the role of the Oslo Agreement is the fact that after their signing, Israeli governments intensified the construction of colonies in the West Bank, the dispossession of Palestinians, and the violence used to oppress them. This means several things. Third, it is not true to say that Oslo is dead, as was said after Trump unveiled his absurd plan for Palestine in January 2020. Trump's plan is actually, in my opinion, the natural result of Oslo. Those who claim that Oslo is a moribund process, a failed initiative, are assuming, without critical distance, the stated intentions of the agreement as a peace process, rather than considering Oslo from the perspective of its actual practices and consequences. From this perspective, from the perspective of actual practices and consequences of Oslo, Palestinians are in the middle of Oslo, trapped by their deleterious effects. Today, after years of rhetorical commitment to peace, we are only witnessing the true face of Oslo, a process whose objective was never the exchange of peace for land, but rather the Israeli conquest of peace and land. But let's not make the mistake we made with Oslo again. Do not believe that Trump's absurd and shameful proposal and that of his son-in-law, the real estate journal, will die on paper and will have no consequences. Because as Bertrand Russell already said in the 1970s, shortly before he died, and which is something that we have been able to verify since 1948, quotation, Bertrand Russell, "Each new conquest of Israel becomes the new basis for a negotiation proposed from force and which ignores the injustice of the previous aggression." This explains why Ehud Barak, former Prime Minister of Israel, once declared that, and I quote, if I were a Palestinian of the right age, at some point I would have joined the resistance. Perhaps Barak had read Frantz Fanon when in his The Wretches of the Earth, he says, colonialism is not a machine capable of thinking or a body endowed with reason. Colonialism is naked violence, and it only gives way when faced with greater force. To conclude the first part of my intervention, and I don't know for how long I have been, I want to say that all these calls into question the very premises on which a solution to Israeli colonialism needs to be thought and solved. A two-state solution would mean the consolidation and legitimation of a colonial regime driven by racial segregation, religious fanatism, and genocidal militarism. It would be like trying to solve the question of South Africa apartheid by dividing the country and giving most of the territory to white settlers to create their own state where apartheid and its colonial violence could simply continue. Such a state would be an affront to our political and moral convictions, especially after witnessing the genocide in Gaza now and the racist and religiously fanatic forces driving it. The way forward to me, the way forward is clear to me. The total defeat of Zionism and the creation of one democratic state. I have some time. 2 minutes. Okay. So, now that we have explained the Nakba as a process and as a structure, going from 1948 to today, I want to invite you to think the Nakba and how one can relate to it and its last iteration in the Gaza genocide. And I want to invite you to do so from a purely human perspective. This human perspective, generally ignored, seems to be, to me, politically powerful and inspiring, but also intellectually necessary. For after any Nakba, any genocide, massacre, or other atrocity, we, not only those directly affected by these events, but all of us, are confronted to many questions that, if not responded, come back to haunt us. I will refer only to 2 of them, and I will do it again by referring mostly to Jewish writers and thinkers. I think this helps to comprehend the universality of the values that oppose these horrors, and also highlight the danger lurking over us, the fact that the Palestinian Nakba and the current genocide in Gaza are something that can happen to anyone. When the world is indifferent and some parts even supportive of what is going on in Gaza, they are basically saying that this is permissible, a permissible way of dealing with political conflict. It seems that, as Hegel once said, the only thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. The first necessary question that we need to respond, paraphrasing here the German Jewish thinker Theodor Adorno, asks how it is possible to write poetry or to even sing after Gaza. By this, I mean what value, urgency, or urgency still conserve our poems, our thoughts, our theories, our dreams for the future, without before reckoning with, in Primo Levi's words, the sinister news of what humans in outrage have done to other humans. The second question is not an intellectual or theoretical one, but rather the vital question of how to live after these Nakbas, these Holocaust, these concentration camps. For all humans in all these places are Primo Levi. When describing the Jewish condition in Nazi Germany, he says, in an instant, quotation, in an instant, in an almost prophetic intuition, reality shows itself. We have reached the bottom. It is not possible to fall lower than this. There is no. It is not possible to conceive a human condition more miserable than ours. Nothing belonged to us. They took our clothes, our shoes, even our hair. If we speak, they will not hear us. And even if they heard us, they will not understand. They will take even our name. And if we want to conserve it, we will have to find in ourselves the necessary strength so that behind our name, something of us, something of what we were, subsists. Do not mistake, these are urgent questions not only for the humans injured or demolished by hatred and violence, but for all of us, for where were we if we are not the victims? On the side of the oppressor? Or submerged in the terrible indifference of our victims? Is not that somehow the same thing? So we all lose parts of our humanity in the Gazas, the Auschwitz, and the Nakbas of history. This is precisely another lesson that Primo Levi brings from the camp when he says, quotation, and on the scaffoldings, on the trains, on the roads, in the trenches, in the offices, humans and humans, slaves and the masters themselves and slaves. So how to think and to live life after knowing what humans are capable of doing to other humans? Please allow me to start by the second question, how to live life after the Nakbas, the Holocaust, and these concentration camps. I will try to be very fast. Well, there are not many options. I think either one lives a life of bitterness and resentment, a frozen existence of a resolute, domineering person, shadowed by pain, fearful of the other, consumed by nihilism, protected by an agonized withdrawal from the world, but in any case, without real joy. If we do so, we would end up singing with Mahmoud Darwish. Our generation is dead and buried. Dead and buried is our generation. The conquerors were reborn in us. The tyrants have multiplied in ourselves. Or the alternative, one lives like a sail in flaming winds of hope, open as a bow, ready to be thrown into deep love, generosity, solidarity, the search for the other, moved by her struggle, and ready to fight for her dignity, humanity, and freedom. This is how I read Che Guevara's line, the true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love. Regarding now the first question, how to write poetry or even to think after the camps and the Gazas of history. Well, many of you here today show that a life, however lived, whatever you are doing, wherever you find yourself, only acquires a complete meaning when it has at its center a sincere, a tireless struggle to uphold the never again and the not on my name, but also a positive engagement with justice and solidarity. Revolt, says Jean Genet in his book Prisoner of Love, which I read as his love letter to Palestinians. Revolt takes, he says, the name revolution when it lasts and is structured, when no longer only a poetic negation, it turns into political affirmation. By this I mean that if writing poetry, thinking, organizing solidarity have any urgency today, it is in order to imagine, to dream, to conceive a world where the camps, the Nakbas, the Gazas, in any of their possible forms, do not have a place. That is why I like Susan Wei's definition of solidarity as love expressed through the determined action. Well, I want to finish by simply saying to the organizers and all of you present today that what you do is an inspiration for Palestinians and for people committed to solidarity with Palestine, with Palestine and beyond. An example of what Bertolt Brecht meant when he once said, quotation, there are people who struggle for a day and they are good. There are people who struggle for a year and they are better. There are people who struggle for many years and they are better still. But there are those who struggle all their lives. These are the indispensable ones. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.